Thank you for tuning in today and welcome back to another episode of The Source. I'm your host, Zain Raza. Before I start this interview, I would like to remind you to join our alternative channels on Rumble and Telegram. YouTube, which is owned by Google, can shadow ban and censor us at any time, especially given the fact that we provide you with an alternative narrative to what you hear in the mainstream media. If that day ever comes, we won't be able to reach you with our information, let alone with an announcement. Hence, as a precautionary measure, we are asking all our viewers to join these alternative channels. And if you're watching our videos regularly, make sure to support our journalism with a donation. We're an independent and non-profit media organization that does not take any money from corporations or governments. Hence, we only depend on you. And even though we've been growing over the summer with our views and subscriptions, the donations haven't followed suit. To find out how you can join our alternative channels as well as how to donate to our journalism, click on the description of this video below. Today I'll be talking to author and historian Vijay Prashad. Vijay Prashad is the author of more than 30 books, one of them being The Withdrawal, Iraq, Libya, Afghanistan, and the Fragility of US Power. Vijay, welcome back to the show.
Very nice to be with you. Yeah.
I would like to start off with Gaza, where the humanitarian crisis has reached catastrophic levels. The UN has warned that the entire population of Gaza is now at risk of hunger and starvation, describing it as a, quote, man-made humanitarian catastrophe, unquote. More than 100 humanitarian and human rights organizations, including Doctors Without Borders, Amnesty International, Save the Children, and Oxfam, have issued urgent alerts about mass starvation, reporting at least 111 famine-related deaths, mostly children, this month. These groups are demanding an immediate ceasefire, the lifting of Israel's total siege, and unrestricted access for food, water, medicine, electricity, and fuel. On 21st of July 2025, 28 countries, including the UK, Canada, Japan, France, Italy, and Spain, signed a joint declaration urging Israel to halt its military offensive, end the blockade, and restore humanitarian access. However, Germany has not joined this initiative. German Chancellor Friedrich Merz did issue a strong public statement yesterday, and let me quote him here. Quote, I would also like to urge the Israeli government in the strongest possible terms to stop the massive military intervention, to allow a ceasefire, and above all, to enable humanitarian aid for the population there, unquote. At the same time, however, Germany continues to authorize substantial military exports to Israel. Since October 7, 2023, Berlin has approved nearly 485 million euros worth of weapons and equipment, firearms, ammunition, electronics, and armored vehicles. In the media here, the German government stance is frequently framed as morally complex, with heavy emphasis on its historical responsibility stemming from the Holocaust. In your view, is Germany genuinely navigating a necessary balance between historical guilt and its obligation under international humanitarian law? Or is this media framing being used to obscure deeper geopolitical interests that run contrary to Germany's stated human rights commitments?
It's a very good question you've asked, and I'm really glad you framed it so directly regarding Germany's role in this. I was recently in Germany, and I went for the first time in my life to a concentration camp. I'd never visited a camp before. I went to Buchenwald. And in Buchenwald, I was struck by the kind of stories that people have remembered. There's a place in Buchenwald where Soviet soldiers, in fact, young Russian farm boys, if we're honest, were brought to a stable, made to take their height, thinking that this is about some sort of registration, and was shot in the neck from behind. They shot some 8,000 Soviet soldiers. It was young German farm boys shooting young Russian and other Tatar farm boys. That's what it was. A horrible, horrible nightmare. But Germany has to deal with its own history. It has an ugly history. I don't think Germany has actually dealt with it. In fact, I was quite surprised with the way the pamphlets I was given describe Buchenwald. It becomes narrowed to a question of the Holocaust against the Jews. There's very little about those communists there. It was the place where, the leader of the Communist Party was assassinated one night, Ernst Thälmann. And also there were gypsies, there were others who were there and killed. Horrible situation. It is true that there was a final solution against the Jewish population. Germany has to deal with that history. I don't think it is. In fact, the memorial in Buchenwald is totally uncared for. The writing on the stone is deteriorating. The grass is growing through the cracks. It looks like a Roman ruin rather than a memorial to the people killed at Buchenwald. Why is Germany not facing up to its own reality rather than thinking that it can expiate its guilt by supporting whatever Israel does? This is a very unfair way to deal with its history. You want to deal with your history? Do what used to happen. Take all school children to see a concentration camp. In East Germany, in the DDR, it was obligatory. All school children were taken to see concentration camps because they were told this must never happen again. That kind of thing that happened to Germany must never happen again. Today in Germany, this united Germany, it's not obligatory for school children to go to see a concentration camp. They don't need to. You're surprised about the rise of the Alliance for Deutschland? Entire generations have not been told the actuality of their history. You try to expiate guilt by outsourcing the guilt to supporting Israel's genocide against the Palestinians. Absolutely unfair. I use the word unfair. It's unfair to do that because the Palestinians did not conduct the final solution. It was Germany who conducted the final solution. It was Hitler and others who were German and Austrian who conducted the decision making. There were no Palestinians in the room. Why should the Palestinians pay the price for the German Holocaust? It is very unfair. And that's exactly what Germany is doing. I'm saying it to you directly. It's unfair. There's no other word. It's about fairness. Germans should have compassion for the Palestinians who are starving to death now and also being bombed in Gaza. They're being starved to death. Children are dying of starvation. The UN keeps saying there's a danger of this happening. In fact, it's already happening. There are already children dying of starvation. And it's unfair that Germany continues to support Israel. It is unfair. I find the fairness doctrine, applies here. How fair is this to people? I find this hideous, and let me tell you something. I went to visit Buchenwald. I don't think, Zain, I could go to Auschwitz. I was crying in Buchenwald. If I went to Auschwitz, I would collapse. I cannot understand industrial scale killing like that of innocent people. I have been to Gaza. I have wept in Gaza. I went to Gaza in 2014. I wept. 3,000 Palestinians had been killed then. Now the numbers are unbelievable. Yeah. 3,000 was one too many for me. 1, 2, industrial scale killing. It's not just one or two people. It is unfair. What Chancellor Merz is saying, what your so-called green feminist foreign minister is saying is unfair. They are not being fair to the Palestinian people. And that's how I think Germans should take this.
I want to take a closer look at Israel's domestic situation. In April 2025, the International Monetary Fund, IMF, revised Israel's 2025 GDP growth forecast down to 3.2% from an earlier estimate of around 5.4%, citing the mounting economic toll of prolonged military campaigns and declining investor confidence. To finance expanding war efforts, the Israeli government approved an additional $12.5 billion in military spending for 25 and 26. And this was accompanied by a value-added tax increase from 17 to 18%, higher income tax, and cuts to public services, placing growing pressure on Israel's middle and working classes. Meanwhile, the Times of Israel reported in April 2025 that approximately 1,700 millionaires had left the country over the past year. Politically, Prime Minister Netanyahu's coalition is now on the brink of collapse. In mid-July 2025, both the ultra-Orthodox factions withdrew from the government after Netanyahu failed to pass the long-promised military draft exemption law. Netanyahu was unable to pass this law, as according to Plus 972 magazine, the Israeli army has been facing serious challenges with its reservist system, as tens of thousands of reservists have refused or failed to report for duty due to burnout, moral objection, and no concrete plan for the war in Gaza in the future. The withdrawal of these parties left Netanyahu with just 60 of 120 Knesset member seats, creating a legislative deadlock and could lead to a no confidence vote or early elections. Historically, South Africa's apartheid regime collapsed in large part due to sustained external international pressure. How do you view the future of Israel's apartheid state? Can it continue to exist with these internal contradictions and pressures as long as they gain support from powerful actors such as the US and Germany? And is a Palestinian state even possible at this stage?
Yeah, it's another good question. Today you're coming at me with very good questions. Let's start with some comparisons. Okay, you said the projected growth rate is about 3%. Yeah, in the war economy. Just let's consider this. The Bundesbank has projected Germany's growth rate next year at 0.7%. Okay, so Israel is actually in comparison to Germany booming. Why? Because it's a war economy. And in a war economy, it's all hands on deck to produce war material, and also you continue to see money flood in from people like Germany, United States, Britain, France, whatever. They're continuing to finance. The FDI is going to be substantial in Israel. It's, okay, billionaires are fleeing and whatever, but Western countries are still holding up Israel. They are putting money. The United States is not stopping its underwriting of Israel. Israel has a higher growth rate than Germany. Germany should build its own trains. Why is it, trying to help Israel? Israel is doing better than Germany. I mean, I was, again, quite surprised by the lack of infrastructural investment in Germany, for public transport, for train services, and so on. Why are you wasting your money sending it to Israel to conduct a genocide? Build your own trains. Yeah, build up your own country. They have a GDP 3 times yours. Okay, so that's pretty ridiculous. Can Israel exist? Well, firstly, Zionism is the real contradiction, because Zionism is a supremacist ideology. Zionism suggests that Jews must be superior to everybody in the land between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean Sea, that the Jews should control it all. In fact, in the state of Israel, Jews have a greater citizenship, standing than anybody else. If you're Jewish outside Israel, you can walk in and you can get residency. Palestinians cannot come in. Others also cannot. It's a supremacist state. In Germany, when you are in Germany, you can get naturalized. There's a process. In Germany, there is not 2 classes of citizens. I mean, maybe there's racism and so on, even structural racism. But legally, anybody can, rent an apartment anywhere. It's not that case in Israel. That is why a number of UN documents and human rights organizations say that Israel is an apartheid state, that within the borders of Israel, it's a bifurcated nationality. That if you're Jewish, your nationality is of greater value than if you're anybody else, not just Palestinian, but anybody else. So anybody, can see that it is an apartheid state. That is an untenable state. You can't create an apartheid state forever. We know that emancipation is delicious and it's basically unstoppable. Yeah, we know that. In all countries, people continue to struggle against any hierarchy. Zionism is a structural hierarchy. It is going to be defeated. And so when people say from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free, that slogan, what they are saying is from the river to the sea, they should not rule Zionism. It should be people who are equal. Can't there be a secular democratic state? This poses a challenge to the leadership in Israel because they are committed to, in a sense, Jewish supremacy through Zionism. And so if you allow for a democratic state where everybody has equality, you incorporate the occupied territories of Gaza, the West Bank, and East Jerusalem, there is a fear that, the people who will be incorporated as full citizens will not necessarily vote for Zionism. They may vote for other parties. They may vote for a secular agenda. They may say that why should Orthodox Jews not serve in the army? I mean, the reason Mr. Netanyahu is facing trouble in his government isn't about the genocide in Palestine. It's just that there's an exception for Orthodox Jews not to be a reservist in the army. And Netanyahu, faced with pressure, wants to bring the Orthodox Jews into the army because they need soldiers. But this is not going to happen. These parties, the right-wing parties, will leave the coalition. So if you have a secular state is not going to allow these exceptions. Yeah. So that is Zionism. That's not Israel. Israel/Palestine could continue for a long time, but Zionism has no place in the world. No supremacist ideology, race, whether it's white supremacy, we would condemn white supremacy or German supremacy. What is that? That's effectively Nazism, Aryanism or something. It's illegal. These things should not be permitted. Zionism is an abomination, in my opinion. Yeah, Zionism as a messianic understanding in the Jewish tradition is fine, but Zionism as a political practice, that comes from Theodor Herzl, that's a supremacist ideology. It should not be permitted.
Let us switch to a development that surprised many, namely Israel's recent airstrike on Syria amid sectarian violence happening there. Between July 13 and 16, intense clashes broke out in Syria's Druze majority Sveda province, pitting Druze militias against Sunni Bedouin tribes. According to the Syrian Observatory for Human Rights, at least 516 people were killed, while other human rights organizations estimate up to 1,000 deaths, making it one of the deadliest weeks in Syria since the fall of the Assad regime. Syria's interim government, led by President Ahmed al-Shara, formerly known as Mohammed al-Julani, deployed security forces to the Sveida in an attempt to restore order there. However, multiple observers have accused the government of siding with the Bedouin fighters, including reports of extrajudicial killings of Druze civilians and executions. In response, Israel launched airstrikes on July 16, targeting the Syrian Defense Ministry in Damascus and military positions in Saveda and Dara. Israel framed the operation as an effort to protect the Druze minority. A ceasefire was eventually brokered on 17th of July, mediated by the United States, Turkey, Jordan, and Arab states, which allowed for the withdrawal of the Bedouin fighters and limited redeployment of Syrian government troops into Sveida to maintain order. The US clarified that it did not support Israel's strikes, but emphasized its diplomatic role in brokering the ceasefire and pressed the interim government to respect minority rights. First, can you explain whether the Israeli government's justification for bombing Syrian targets to protect the Druze community has any legitimacy? And second, how do you view the broader situation in Syria? Do you believe that sectarian violence and internal conflict will continue to destabilize the country, even as the United States and the West begin lifting sanctions on the post-Assad government?
Well, in fact, I've just reported a story which will come out from Globetrotter as we speak and should be published in different places. I hope there'll be a publication of it in Germany. It's a pretty long piece. The argument that I make in this piece is that this has nothing to do with protecting the Druze, the group called Men of Dignity. Nothing. It has nothing to do with any fight with Bedouin tribes. The essence of this issue are twofold. Number one, Israel already occupied the Golan Heights in 1967. The Golan Heights stand in proximity to As-Suwaida, which is near the Jordanian border. There's the Golan Heights, and then there's this crescent that goes from Dara to As-Suwaida, just north of Jordan and south of Damascus. It's a very interesting area of farms. Now, Israel, after the fall of the Assad government, when Ahmad Shara came and took power, the former Al-Qaeda leader of Jabhat al-Nusra, Israel moved into the farmland area just off the Golan Heights, proximity to Dara, and took a very large area which used to be the UN buffer zone. Okay, they were there. At that time, the Men of Dignity, this is the Druze group, made an alliance with the Bedouin forces to create something called Southern Operations to protect that area from chaos, because they worried about the Al-Qaeda forces coming into that area. There's lots of minority groups. They're not just the Druze. They were quite worried about that. And they were also worried about further Israeli incursions. Now, the other great secret, that's the one issue, that it's not about protecting the Druze. Israel has its own interest in expanding its territory. This is about territorial gains, okay? push the Druze men of dignity back and perhaps extend the so-called buffer zone, which soon will become, Israel. That's the plan. That's number one issue. Second issue is when I was reporting the war in Syria, it became very clear that neither the Jabhat al-Nusra boys nor the boys from the Syrian army, because again, just as I said with Buchenwald, these are all farm kids, and small town kids. I met many of them from all sides. Many of them had no ideological convictions in the fight. Okay, they were not interested. What fueled them was an amphetamine drug called Captagon, which was widely being used by all these kids. And Captagon is produced in the farms north of the Jordanian border near As-Suwaida. And I think my story is going to be the first story that talks about this aspect of the Israeli attack. In that area of As-Suwaida, there were many big drug kingpins who were selling Captagon, which is a little bit like fentanyl. It's like a opioid type of amphetamine. They were selling this in Jordan, into Israel, in Syria, and even in Lebanon. This is a huge market these people were using. And they were using a lot of Bedouin kids to cart this stuff across the Jordanian border. In January of this year, Jordan's Air Force struck Syria. Nobody reported it. They struck some of these farms because they're trying to get rid of Captagon in the area. This is also a fight over Captagon. And lots of money and lots of interests are involved. When they said, the Druze and the Bedouin, it's not an ethnic conflict. I'm telling you, this is part of the drug war in southern Syria. So on the one side, it's Israeli expansionism. On the other side, it's the drug war. This is nothing to do with ethnicity, nothing to do with protecting the Druze. Senior Druze leaders said, we don't want Israel's protection. I mean, what are you talking? The Druze are not a people sitting around praying all day. They have an army. It's called men of dignity. Okay. I mean, you want to check it out. It's the Harakat Rijal al Karama. It's an army, man. It's the men of dignity. They don't need protection. Yeah. But they are also involved in the drug war because they have been involved in trying to get rid of some of the big kingpins in the area. There's a lot of money and violence there. So the reporting on this, as with so much to do with West Asia, is appalling. Immediately, the reporting takes the press release from Israel and pretends that that's the story. Israelis are bombing to protect the Druze. It's a ridiculous Israeli propaganda. There's nothing to it. I completely reject it. And as a journalist, I am sometimes embarrassed at how our newspapers and wire services are stenographers for people in power. They just take what they're given by the Israeli spokesperson and pretend that that's reality. You have no idea what As-Suwaida looks like. You have no idea about the farms and villages in the south. No idea about the harakat that operates there. It's embarrassing, Zain, embarrassing.
I mean, they targeted al-Suwaida, but also the Syrian Defense Ministry. And one would have thought that the Israeli government is quite content with the new Syrian government because it ensured hostilities, a hostile relationship with Iran as well as Hezbollah. So why do you think the Israeli government bombed the Syrian Defense Ministry?
Well, it's really interesting because Ahmad al-Sharaa has done everything that the Israelis would want. He has expelled the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine leaders. He expelled the Hamas leaders. He jailed the Islamic Jihad leaders. These are all Palestinians. Then he basically allows Israel to continue to fire on Syrian soil. He never says anything about it. Yeah. In this case, I think the Israelis were sending him a message. And the message was the following. Firstly, it's very clear that the Syrian army is very much involved in the drug trade. So I wasn't exactly sure why they hit the ministry, unless it was to send a message about the drug trade. Israel is not happy about this drug trade. It so-called corrupts a lot of Israeli kids, a lot of drugs in Israel. Yeah. And so I know this because when Israeli soldiers come to do rest and recreation in Manali in India, after they've done their hideous tours of duty oppressing Palestinians, they come to Manali and sit out in the sunshine, in this beautiful town, and they smoke ganja, marijuana all day. There is a drug problem in Israel, and Captagon has entered Israel for raves and so on. And I don't know exactly, we don't know exactly what the story is there, why they hit the defense ministry. Could have something to do with that. But also, Ahmad al-Shara hasn't yet said, I recognize Israel. He hasn't said that yet. He hasn't said, I recognize Israel and I de facto agree with the border where Israel is. He hasn't done that. I mean, if he does that, he may be assassinated, because there are people in Damascus who would go crazy if he does that. It's one thing for Anwar al-Sadat to do that, which he did. He was the first to recognize Israel. And then what happened to Anwar al-Sadat? He was shot at a military parade. He was assassinated. And the issue was recognition of Israel. Okay? He was shot to death. The King of Jordan recognized Israel in 1994. But Jordan, you can't, it's a totally, in one sense, a repressive monarchy. They're not going to have, but people are upset. Half the population of Jordan is Palestinian. They're upset. The Queen of Jordan right now, of the son of the king who recognized Israel, is Palestinian. Yeah, she has made some strong statements. Lebanon has not yet recognized Israel, and it will be very difficult for the Lebanese government, however pro-American the current government is. Ahmad al-Shara must be sitting in his palace in Damascus thinking, if I do this, will I have Anwar al-Sadat's fate? Will I be shot to death? And if he doesn't do it, will the Israelis bomb him? Because they want right now Syria to be, like Jordan and Egypt. Then they only have one border to worry about, which is the Lebanese border, which they've pacified to a great extent. Yeah. So maybe this is a message to Ahmad al-Shara. Listen, pal, if we don't kill you, they will kill you. Somebody's going to kill you. So we'll kill you worse than them. We'll bomb you and you'll die. They didn't bomb the presidential palace. They bombed the defense ministry and some houses near the president. I don't have enough information on who was bombed near the presidential palace. But I think it's a very clear, loud and clear message to Ahmad al-Shara that you better recognize us, because, we are here and we can do you harm and you can't do anything about it.
Let us switch gears here and move to another war, this time in Ukraine. Since June 1st, Russia has launched an estimated 10,370 drones and 387 missiles into Ukrainian territory, constituting the most intensive aerial campaign of the entire war. On the ground, Russian forces have made incremental gains in Donetsk and Kharkiv regions, capturing multiple villages, while Ukraine forces remain primarily on the defensive, launching drone strikes against Russian supply lines and depot deep inside enemy Russian territory, but without achieving any major territorial breakthroughs. In July 2025, the United States made a significant reversal in policy, according to some independent alternative media commentators. President Trump, who had earlier in the year signaled a reduction in US support and warned Ukrainian Prime Minister Zelensky that it could spark a World War III, just recently approved a new $322 million military aid package. This includes air defense systems and armored attack vehicles, all funded and bought by NATO partners who will supply this then to Ukraine. Washington also issued a 50-day secondary sanctions ultimatum on Russia, and Trump publicly criticized President Putin for continuing to pursue war. Diplomatic efforts resumed with a third round of talks in Istanbul on July 23rd. However, they focused solely on prisoner exchange. No meaningful discussions occurred regarding ceasefire framework or broader peace settlement. At least when it came to Ukraine, there was hope that Trump would end the war. Why do you think he reversed course and completely abandoned the dialogue around territorial concessions and Ukraine's NATO membership?
Yeah, look, frankly, it's interesting because Trump oversold his ability. He came in saying, I can end this in a day. I think he didn't quite understand the stakes at play for all sides. In other words, What are the war aims? I think that's an important thing to recognize. What do the Russians seem to want? In many ways, the Russians already have the territory that they want, which is they've got a land bridge through Mariupol all the way to Crimea. They've consolidated their hold on Crimea, and the republics in the east, majority Russian republics of Donetsk and so on, they've all entered into Russian territory. They've made these people's republics and whatnot. In fact, that had happened after 2014, that they had effectively seceded from Ukraine, and Russia went in basically to protect them from the assault from the Ukrainian army. So from the Russian perspective, they've attained their war aims. The only thing they haven't got is a commitment from Kiev for so-called denazification. That means to get rid of the people who support, Stefan Bandera and that crowd. I think that's an important thing that they want Ukraine to do, and they also want Ukraine to say we will not join NATO. These are very important war aims for the Russians, and so Kiev has a different perspective. From Kiev's perspective, Mr. Zelensky understands that, look, there's going to have to be a territorial, debate and discussion. It's very unlikely the Russians will leave this. They will fight for a long time to hold this. They are not interested in, it seems to me, in further territorial gains to hold. They may want to make some gains in the north, so that they can then barter that away, saying, okay, we'll withdraw from there, but we're going to keep this. It seems to me that's what the further gains could mean. I don't think this is about, they don't want to take Kiev. They don't want to occupy all of Ukraine. There's no indication that that's what they want. Okay, they want to hold this. So from the Ukraine perspective, either they have to come to terms with the fact that, look, we are not going to get the Donbass region back, and we have shown that we'll cut the water to Crimea, so it's very unlikely that the Russians will give up the land bridge, because we are not a reliable partner to provide basic services to the Crimeans. They're going to have to get water from Russia. You can't get water out of, and whatever. I'm sure they can get it out of the Black Sea and clean it up, but thus far they rely on other places to get. Anyway, these are issues of debate and discussion at the negotiation table, but the land question is off the limits, I think. There's not much to be debated. The question of NATO membership, I think for Mr. Zelensky is a point of pride now. I mean, what is he going to gain? If two sides go to a table, either one has to feel like it's lost everything, or both have to walk away thinking, our dignity is intact. We won something. They are going to push for NATO membership or something like that in order for Zelensky to feel like he got a win out of this. And I think the NATO countries backing Ukraine are also needing dignity. Germany, France, they're not going to allow a defeat of Ukraine here. So we have two sides with irreconcilable aims. The Russians are not going to walk out of their territory. And the Ukrainians and their European partners, the United States is really hard to gauge, want a win of some kind. I don't think Merz or Macron are going to allow a complete walkover. They are going to push for some win. That's why they are building up their support and so on. I'm surprised they haven't already brought Ukraine into NATO. At the meeting in The Hague, they could have done some sort of emergency thing. I think they want a win. But I don't think they want to win beforehand. Like declaring Ukraine as part of NATO at The Hague would not have been a negotiation win. That would have been a de facto move, which would have really angered the Russians. They would have withdrawn from any talks. I think they want at the talks to say to the Russians, okay, you're going to take the Donbass and Mariupol, but Ukraine joins NATO. And I don't think the Russians are going to permit that. That's why the war continues. It's grinding war, There's no space for the table. Russia is going to say it's unacceptable for us, as they've said all along, for Ukraine to join NATO. But then if Russia doesn't cede the territory, what does NATO get out? And what does Ukraine get out of the negotiation? Very little. So I can see why this is a stalemate. Ukraine has to be able to find something, to get out of this. I mean, a security agreement. I don't know what is on the table, but I can tell you that I very much doubt that this coalition in Germany right now, the Merz government, and I doubt that Macron, the two major backers of the Ukrainians now, that the Americans are who knows where. Yeah, I doubt very much they would permit, and I use the word permit advisedly, a complete surrender of Ukraine, because then it's an embarrassment for them. I mean, they've backed this war. They've made it a NATO war since the beginning. I mean, they will walk away looking like fools. And so, unfortunately, ego and geopolitics is really preventing, I think, a pretty rational discussion and debate. I mean, I don't know what people in Europe think. You can't defeat Russia. That'd be a nuclear war. I mean, it's not going to be possible. There has to be a negotiated settlement. And that settlement is not going to be that Russia withdraws to the, whatever it is, January 22nd or 21st line. They're not going to do that. That's not possible. The Donbass is gone. Yeah. The issue is Mariupol and the land bridge. Can they negotiate that away? Would they do that? Or would they say maybe they'll manage it together, condominium? I don't know. I don't know what's on the table. But I very much doubt that the Russians would say, okay, we'll withdraw back to the Donbass. So Donbass and Crimea are gone to Russia. I doubt that. I think the land bridge is non-negotiable for them.
One of the key arguments that the German political establishment makes is that if Ukraine agrees to surrender territory and abandon NATO aspirations under Russian military pressure, wouldn't that set a dangerous precedent that a nuclear armed state can just redraw borders by force? What's to stop Russia, or any other authoritarian power for that matter, from using that same strategy again in the future? Isn't accepting these demands just postponing the next war rather than preventing it?
Well, it again depends on how one sees this war. I mean, it's interesting. If you are a country and bordering your country, and this is a problem with national boundaries and modern states. If you have a minority group right across the border who are part of your community, what do you do if they are being persecuted? Do you enter into the conflict? I mean, that's part of what happened. The other part of what happened was the issue of NATO expansion. There is no other example of this. Perhaps the closest is if the West tries to tighten the ring around China. Would China also then, go into a war to prevent the ring from tightening? I mean, Russia didn't want the ring to tighten. This has been there on the table since 1990. When they had the discussion in Germany, Shevardnadze and Baker and so on, and Kohl was the big giant. Kohl was sitting there, monitoring the process. I mean, these are all supposed to be serious men. They made an agreement. The Soviets said Germany can be united, but NATO can't move east of the German border. That was a gentleman's agreement. It was written in the minutes. I've read the minutes. Many people have read the minutes. Yeah, where it was written. Baker agreed, and then NATO moves. Right afterwards, almost. I mean, not exactly afterwards. When the Soviet Union collapsed, the appetite to move the EU was high, the European Union. But I think the Americans understood that if the EU moved into the eastern part of Europe, the United States would lose its influence over Europe. And so where the EU went, NATO went. And where NATO goes, the United States goes, because NATO is effectively a Trojan horse for US power. I mean, even the current Secretary General of NATO goes to Washington, Mark Rutte, and in the presence of Trump says, we'll make the NATO summit in The Hague a great display of American power. American power? I thought it was a NATO meeting. No, it's American power. And so where the EU expanded, NATO went, because the United States wanted to make sure it still controls the levers of Europe. And this was a threat to Russia. I don't think this will repeat. The only other place it could repeat is China. If the United States, but the United States will not succeed. India just opened tourist visas again for the Chinese. India-China relations is going to improve. Mark my words. There's a lot of pressure to improve the relationship. Yeah, mark my words on that. I don't think you're going to. So this is a unique example. I don't think one should say, well, if you give in here, it's going to happen again. I mean, could, obviously. But I don't think this sets a precedent. You want a bad precedent? The illegal US war in Iraq was a bad precedent because that set a precedent for Libya and so on. These are illegal major destructions of countries. That's not what's exactly happening in Ukraine. I mean, the what's it called? Russians aren't bombing all the infrastructure in Ukraine, destroying the airports, destroying railway systems. Everything seems to be functioning. I mean, Zelensky leaves the country. He leaves from Kiev airport. He doesn't have to drive across the border to Poland. Hey, there's no airport anymore in Gaza. There used to be the Yasser Arafat airport in Rafah. That was destroyed long ago.
I want to turn to the conflict that happened between Israel and Iran and the US in June. Israel on June 13 launched Operation Rising Lion, a 12-day aerial assault striking over 100 targets across Iran, nuclear sites, missile bases, and residence of military and scientific personnel. Israel claims to have destroyed around 120 missile launchers, military installations, and even prison facilities. However, the campaign also hit civilian infrastructure, including hospitals, and according to human rights organizations, around 1,000 civilians died in Iran. Iran retaliated using over 150 ballistic missiles and hundreds of drones, attacking Israel's military bases and civilian areas, including the Soroka hospital, causing around 28 civilian deaths in total and 3,200 injuries. On June 22nd, US joined the campaign in Operation Midnight Hammer, deploying B-2 bombers and Tomahawk missiles against 3 Iranian nuclear sites, Natanz, Fordow, and Isfahan. US officials claim they set Iran's nuclear program back by 1 or 2 years, and a mid-July Pentagon review later confirmed significant damage to the Fordow facility. Iran responded by striking US bases in Qatar, Syria, and in Iraq. However, no American casualties were reported. A ceasefire was eventually brokered on June 24th, but tensions remain high. Iran has suspended IEA cooperation on July 16, and Supreme Leader Khamenei said Iran is prepared for even larger strikes thanks to enhanced precision capabilities. Just yesterday, an Iranian helicopter intercepted the US destroyer USS Fitzgerald in the Gulf of Oman and claimed it approached Iranian territorial waters. Vijay, how do you assess the military campaign launched by Israel and the US against Iran? Were the strategic objectives actually achieved?
Well, it's very hard to say what the objectives were. Okay. Firstly, let's just be very clear. Israel and the United States illegally attacked Iran. Why illegal? There was no UN Security Council resolution which authorized this, that this is a violation of the UN Charter. Nobody's screaming and shouting about that. Yeah. Russia violated the UN Charter, entered Ukraine. Ursula von der Leyen was like up in arms. She didn't say anything about illegal attack on Iran. Okay. Totally illegal. Because no UN resolution. This is a treaty obligation on both Israel and the United States. You can't attack a country, but US makes a habit of it. So does Israel. Attack Lebanon. Where was the Security Council resolution for the bombing and killing of Syed Hassan Nasrallah? Nothing. Attacking Syria. Where was the UN resolution? They do it routinely. They violate the UN Charter, but it was a violation. So let's call it what it was. It was an illegal attack. Iran retaliated. That is legal because you retaliated against an illegal attack. Yeah. Iran also approached the UN. That's the legal posture that you're supposed to do. Okay. Illegal attack. Number one. Number two, the Iranians don't have a nuclear weapons program. They have a nuclear energy program. IAEA, the International Atomic Energy Agency, inspectors have gone and looked at things. That's what they say. They say Iran might be able to in the future. It's enriching uranium maybe, but nobody says they had nuclear weapons. Now the mood in Iran is go get nuclear weapons. Let me just put this to you. I wrote an article with the title with my colleague Dae-Han Song from Korea. The title of the article came out from Globetrotter was the Israeli and US attack on Iran is an attack for proliferation. Why? We argue that on the one side, you have the Libyan story. Libya gave up its nuclear weapons program in 2003, 2004 for the agreement that they would then return to the so-called international community so that Muammar Gaddafi's sanctions were lifted and so on, and he could travel everywhere and, he was free. And the Lockerbie case, the plane that crashed in Lockerbie accused of a Libyan agent bringing a bomb onto it, that was also settled. Money was paid and so on. They settled Lockerbie, they gave up their nuclear program. And then in 2011, there was a regime change bombing, illegal, because even though there was a UN Security Council resolution that merely said no fly zone, France and the United States, Germany violated the no fly zone and destroyed the government. There was no resolution for that. Okay, this is an illegal destruction. Meanwhile, North Korea, 2006, tests a nuclear weapon. The only country to test a nuclear weapon in the 21st century. For the first time. So now you choose. What do you want? North Korea, the government is still there. Nobody dares attack it. It has nuclear bomb, or Libya. And so I feel that the government in Iran is thinking, well, they accuse us of making a nuclear bomb. They're going to do a regime change bombardment of us. We don't have a nuclear bomb. They know it. Otherwise, they wouldn't bomb us like this. So let's expedite it and make the bomb and test it and declare we are a nuclear state. Now let's see what they do. And then Turkey will test a bomb. Saudi Arabia will test a bomb. And most likely Myanmar will test a war. Myanmar has just gone into a war with Cambodia. They've just started shooting across the border. The government in Myanmar will ask the North Koreans, we'll pay you, give us the bomb. Yeah. So we argued that this Israeli and US attack on Iran is an attack for proliferation, not for non-proliferation. More people are going to say, might as well get the bomb. Only way to stay safe. Doesn't make me happy. I'm against nuclear weapons fully. But my friend, if you're a rational person, you think better the North Korean outcome than the Libyan one. The state is destroyed now. People are living in very difficult situation. They didn't have a way to immunize themselves from an attack. I mean, North Korea did, and that's the reality.
You argued, correct me if I'm wrong, that Iran has the right under the Non-Proliferation Treaty, NPT, to develop a peaceful nuclear energy program, which includes obviously uranium enrichment. However, I would like to provide the critics' view on that Iran has essentially forfeited that right. They point to serious past violations. For example, in 2002 and 2009, it was revealed that Iran had secretly built uranium enrichment facilities, first in Natanz, then in Qom, which we know as Fordo, without notifying the International Atomic Energy Agency, IAEA, despite being legally obliged to do so under the NPT. These sites were not voluntarily disclosed, but rather uncovered through external sources, including Western intelligence. Critics further argue that Iran's domestic political system cannot be just separated from the nuclear issue. They claim that it's a theoretic regime and has a long-standing record of repressing women, LGBT communities, political dissent, while also supporting armed proxy groups across the region, which include Hezbollah in Iraq, Syria, and the Houthis in Yemen. The concern is that any nuclear capability, peaceful or otherwise, that might be achieved could be misused or fall into one of these hands of these groups. Given this pattern of concealment and this regional tentacle that they usually state that Iran has, don't you think that the international community, which includes the US and Israel, should take all measures possible to prevent Iran from developing a nuclear enrichment program at all, even if it's peaceful?
Well, you seem to be describing Saudi Arabia in a lot of what you're saying. The question of repression. I mean, Saudi Arabia is a complete, almost absolute monarchy. Yeah. There are no elections. The governing council is nominated. I mean, Iran, in contrast, actually has a democratic structure. Now it's guided by the people in charge. They can say you are not fit to run for elections, but there are elections. I mean, you do have 2, 3, 4, 5 candidates in the race. They're called hardliners, reformists, and so on. There are political choices. There are women in the parliament. I mean, whatever. Secondly, it is a guided democratic system, but so are Western democracies. Western democracies are guided by money. The candidates with the most amount of money, who are, in a sense, blessed by the powers that be with money, are the ones that get media attention and so on. If you're not showered with money by the people on top, you can't ascend. So what's the difference? One is you get blessed with money. The other is you get blessed with the kind of religious, theocratic, backing. I don't see, Western democracy is freer than Iranian democracy. Different kind of blessing. In Iran, you get a dua, you get a religious blessing. I think you are the correct person. You are not a correct person to run. You are against our values. And meanwhile, here, you are a leftist, no money to you. We shower money on these right-wing. What's the difference, Zain? I don't see it. Yeah. Okay, let's go even further. The question of, repressing women, headscarf, this, that, and the other. I mean, look, patriarchy exists everywhere. It's not like in Germany, there is no patriarchal signals. Maybe women can, dress as they want in whatever way, but they are also under the laws of its own kind of patriarchy. It's not like Germany has liberated itself from patriarchy and therefore has a moral right to criticize Iran. Every culture has its own battles to deal with patriarchy. Root and branch, it must be taken out, but it's going to be its own battles. Iranian women will fight their own battles. Look, the West said, "Oh, we are going to go and liberate Afghanistan, from the Taliban, bomb them, whatever." Taliban is back in power. I mean, what's this bombing them? You don't change like that. Cultures change from internal struggle. Women are very much alert to that in Iran. I know a lot of women, professors, professionals, people in government. They are doing their own thing, man. They are not, sitting around silent. We just had a conference. 2 Iranian professors came. They spoke their mind. I didn't feel that they were repressed in any way. They said whatever they needed to say. Okay, so people need to meet more Iranians from Iran. Don't take your cues from the Iranian exiles. Look who the Americans and Israelis were talking to as a substitute for the Islamic Republic of Iran. They were talking to the former Shah of Iran's son who lives in Los Angeles. You want to bring back the Shah. Forget democracy. They're not interested in democracy. They're interested in control.
And to the first point that Iran had undisclosed nuclear sites that were discovered through Western intelligence and even dissident groups within Iran. What do you make of that argument? Is that Iran violated the NPT by not disclosing it voluntarily? So therefore, the U.S. and Israel have the right to take all measures possible to prevent Iran from developing any sort of enrichment program because their undisclosure reveals bad intent.
Yeah, but the thing is, there are 2 different issues here. One is Iran's relationship to the International Atomic Energy Agency. Yeah, and the International Atomic Energy Agency hasn't said that Iran is a scofflaw and therefore needs to be sanctioned and so on. This issue with inspections is always going to be a debate and a problem. Country might say, no, these are research labs. We don't want you to see them. We're not producing anything here. We are just developing research on higher levels of enrichment or whatever. This issue of sovereignty and what an international agency can look at, they always have a dispute and debate about that. Every country does. Okay. Every country that's facing, inspections has this. Israel has a nuclear bomb. It's never been inspected by the IAEA. Does that give Iran the right to attack Israel's nuclear weapons facilities? Israel has nuclear weapons, for God's sake, not enrichment. Never been inspected by the IAEA. I don't want to hear Israel tell me about another country's what they are allowed to or not allowed to do. Israel has absolutely no locus standi in this. United States has no locus standi. Where's the IAEA inspections of US? They already have nuclear weapons, for God's sake. Why should they be immune from our disregard? I disregard their opinions. They are already, the United States dropped 2 nuclear weapons on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. None of these, Iran has never dropped a nuclear. In fact, the Ayatollah Khamenei has 2 fatwas inside Iran, which are still standing. He's not withdrawn them, which say we are against weapons of mass destruction. And why did he give the fatwa? Because the United States and Germany, more than the United States, provided material equipment to Iraq to develop a mustard gas program. And they fired mustard gas weapons at Iranian soldiers. In the war between 1980 and 1988, the Federal Republic of Germany, West Germany, was supplying the material for mustard gas. A shame on Germany, actually. After the killing of mass industrial scale killing of Jews with chemical warfare in the ovens of Auschwitz and so on, yeah, with Zyklon B and these things, to have made the components for mustard gas and sold it to Iraq in the 1980s, not that long ago, to use against the Iranians. That's the reason why Iran had a fatwa saying we will not retaliate with weapons of mass destruction, because we have experienced what it does. Yeah, mustard gas in large quantities. So I don't want to hear, the Bundesrepublik, the heir of the Federal Republic of Germany. Yeah, I don't want to hear Mr. Merz and Baerbock and all these people lecture us about weapons of mass destruction. You use those in the kitchens of Auschwitz against Jews using Zyklon B. And now you tell me that, why should they? You gave it to Saddam Hussein to use against the Kurds, in Halabja, and the Iranians across the line between Iran and Iraq in that horrible 8-year war. It was Germany that provided. Don't give me a lecture about, what Iran can and cannot do.
Vijay Prashad, author, historian, and journalist, thank you so much for your time and insights.
Of course, for you anytime, Zain. Thanks a lot.
And thank you for tuning in today. Before you leave, make sure to subscribe to our channel by clicking on the subscribe button below. It takes just a second and costs you nothing. And please don't forget to donate to our independent and non-profit journalism. Journalism that provides you with information that you just won't hear in the corporate and state media. I thank you for your support and for tuning in. I'm Zain Raza. See you next time.